They told you the truth hides in archives, in dusty vaults, in classified documents. They lied. The truth hides in the ordinary, in the gift boxes, the family dinners, the polite smiles of those who say they love you. On Father's Day, I opened a door I didn't know existed. The box was wrapped perfectly, paper smooth as polished lies, and my name, William, written in my daughter's careful hand, the same hand I once held crossing the street when she was 5. My wife's face changed the moment she saw it. Her pupils shrank, breath caught, the way a body reacts when instinct whispers don't look. "Don't open it," she said, her voice not her own. I laughed then, foolishly, the way men laugh before they fall. But when I saw the holes in the cardboard, small and precise, I understood she wasn't warning me as a wife. She was warning me as someone who'd already seen what happens when truth breathes. There was movement inside, soft, deliberate, alive, a heartbeat beneath paper and tape. And in that moment I realized this wasn't about my daughter. It was about inheritance, not of money, but of secrets. Every family carries its own buried scripture, its own sacred corruption passed through generations like heirlooms. We call them traditions. We celebrate them. We don't question what they cost. But that morning, as sunlight filtered through our quiet suburban home, I felt the centuries crawl up my spine. The box wasn't a gift. It was a message. It said, "You don't own what you think you built. You're only the keeper until the next sacrifice." I remember my wife whispering again, "Can't you see?" And for the first time I did. The patterns on the wrapping paper were not decoration. They were sigils, old and geometric, the kind you find carved into forgotten cathedrals and government seals. Symbols that bind obedience to bloodlines. I should have stopped there, called the police, burned the thing. But curiosity is the oldest leash. So I reached for the box, and in doing so I reached for the edge of the world they don't want you to find. The paper tore like skin, and the sound that came from inside wasn't animal. It was memory waking up. The first sound that escaped the box was soft, almost like breathing through glass, but it carried weight, the kind that makes a man remember things he was never taught. My wife stepped back, her voice shaking as she whispered, "It's awake." Not it's moving, not it's alive, but awake, as though the thing inside wasn't an animal, but a thought that had been waiting for permission to exist again. The air thickened, pressing down like unseen hands, and for a moment I could taste metal in my mouth. That's how awakening feels. Not like revelation, but like remembering something you promised to forget. The box pulsed once, faintly, like a heartbeat syncing with mine. I should have felt fear, but what I felt was recognition. Somewhere deep inside, a locked door creaked open. Memories I didn't own flooded through me. Temples carved into mountainsides, priests in gold masks, men swearing oaths in languages lost to maps. The scent of smoke and salt, the same symbols from the wrapping paper glowing faintly beneath my fingers, rearranging themselves into meaning. The line must hold. I didn't understand what it meant, not yet, but it wasn't written for understanding. It was written for obedience. My wife's hand found my arm, trembling. "William," she said, "you don't know what your father kept from you." The words cut deeper than the sound from the box. Because in that instant, I knew she wasn't speaking metaphorically. She knew. She'd always known. My father's funeral, the sealed envelope he left behind, the inheritance I was told to use wisely, the ledger in the attic with names and dates that didn't belong to anyone we knew. Every piece of it began to align, like old gears turning in an ancient lock. The box was never sent by my daughter. She was only the courier. The real sender was older, patient, WATC. Hing from a place where bloodlines are contracts and love is just the bait. I looked at the breathing holes again and realized they weren't to keep something alive. They were to let something out. That's when the first whisper came, not from the box, but from somewhere inside me, a voice I'd never heard but somehow always obeyed. "Open it, William. It's time to remember who you are." When I finally lifted the lid, the room exhaled. Light didn't spill out of the box so much as fold around it, bending the air in ways the eye shouldn't follow. At first I thought it was empty, just a trick of fear, but then the shadows began to move, slow as ink in water. They rose like smoke yet carried weight, settling on my hands, seeping into the lines of my skin. Every heartbeat thundered louder until I realized it wasn't my heart at all. It was the house itself, beating through the floorboards. The photos on the mantel trembled, faces blurring into strangers who stared back as if I were the ghost. My wife's voice came from somewhere distant, warped, as though spoken through water. "Close it, William, please." But my fingers wouldn't obey. They felt commanded by something older than will. The air smelled of burnt cedar and iron, like the breath of an ancient furnace. Then the whisper returned, inside my skull this time, layered with hundreds of other tones, some male, some not quite human. "You've kept their memories too long." Images crashed into me. My daughter at 5, then not my daughter at all, but another child, centuries ago. Kneeling before the same box, my father sealing it, his father watching. Time collapsed into a single endless moment where every man in our line opened the same container and lost something they couldn't name. My eyes burned, vision flooding with impossible architecture, corridors without end, staircases looping back into themselves, and through it all a door made of glass that reflected not my face but theirs. The shadows from the box crawled toward it, dragging me with them until I felt my mind split. One part still standing in the living room, another falling through that mirrored door into a silence that had been waiting. In that silence, I heard the truth every man before me had tried to forget. The inheritance was never wealth. It was memory itself, recycled and imprisoned. I dropped the lid, but it was too late. The sound it made was not a thud, but a closing. My wife was screaming my name, but her voice was muffled by centuries. Somewhere behind her words, another voice whispered softly, almost tenderly, "Now he remembers." Morning came, or at least something pretending to be morning. The light through the curtains looked wrong, too deliberate, as though it had been arranged rather than born. I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, coffee cooling in front of me, the box sealed again on the counter, its edges now impossibly clean, like it had never been opened. My wife moved quietly, avoiding my eyes, her face pale and careful, a mask carved from caution. When she spoke, her words were normal, but her tone carried a tremor that bent reality around it. "You didn't sleep," she said. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I had. Every sound in the house seemed amplified. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock, the slow rhythm of breath. They aligned like instruments following a score only I could hear. I tried to speak, to say something simple, "I'm fine," but my voice came out in echoes, overlapping slightly, as though another version of me had spoken a split second earlier. The world had seams now, faint but visible, places where moments didn't quite fit. My daughter's drawing on the fridge had changed. Colors shifted, shapes rearranged into patterns from the wrapping paper. When I blinked, it was normal again. I began testing reality in small ways, counting the tiles on the floor, glancing at the clock, turning away and checking again. The numbers refused to stay loyal. Time had become elastic. My wife pretended NOT to notice, or maybe she truly couldn't see what I did. I realized then that the box hadn't just opened something in me. It had closed something in everyone else. At work, my colleagues spoke the same sentences on loop, their smiles identical, their movements rehearsed. The world was still functioning, but not alive, a mechanism running without memory. And in its hum, beneath conversation and traffic, I heard it again, that faint pulse syncing with my own. The inheritance hadn't ended with me. It was spreading quietly, rewriting the background of reality one unnoticed detail at a time. I thought of my daughter, somewhere far away, and wondered if she could hear the same rhythm under her heartbeat. Maybe that was the true gift she had sent me, not a curse, but a reminder. Memory had woken, and it wasn't planning to sleep again. Sleep became a negotiation, not a necessity. Every time I closed my eyes, the same dream waited. My father's study, lined with books that breathed like lungs, the smell of tobacco and dust hanging in the air, and the faint ticking of a clock that didn't exist. I began writing everything down, filling notebooks with fragments, diagrams, and half-remembered names. The more I wrote, the less I trusted what was real. My handwriting changed mid-sentence sometimes, tilting into my father's script, or worse, my daughter's. It was as though the memories inside me were competing for dominance, taking turns steering my hands. The box sat on my desk, silent, but its presence felt gravitational. When I leaned too close, I could hear voices whispering in a language I almost understood, a rhythm older than words. I found my father's old journals hidden behind a false panel in the attic, their pages filled with the same sigils from the wrapping paper. Each entry began with a date and ended with a name followed by the phrase, "memory secured." The names stretched back generations, some crossed out, others rewritten, but mine was there, circled in red ink. I didn't remember ever seeing him write it. As I turned the final page, a loose photograph slipped out, my father as a boy, holding a smaller version of the box, smiling at the camera with eyes that weren't quite his own. On the back, in my mother's delicate handwriting, it read, "He passed the test." That night, I dreamt of him standing at the foot of my bed. Not as he was in life, but younger, sharper, his presence too solid for a dream. "It's your turn now," he said softly. "Don't make the same mistake I did." When I asked what mistake, his expression fractured, collapsing into static, and I woke to find my notebook open to a page I hadn't written. Words scrawled in the dark, the first box was never built. It was remembered. My hands shook as I read it, because I finally understood. The box wasn't an object. It was an idea. It didn't come from somewhere. It came from someone. And whoever that someone was, they were still alive, somewhere in the long corridor of blood that led straight to me. The night came without warning. One blink, and the house was gone. I stood inside a landscape that looked built from thought, flat black water reflecting a sky of slow-turning gears instead of stars. Each gear clicked once, and with every click a memory surfaced around me, my childhood bedroom, my daughter's laughter, my father's study, all drifting like islands across the dark. In the center of that impossible sea was a single figure seated before an open box that glowed from within, its light steady, patient, aware. I knew before I spoke that this was the someone who remembered first. They wore no face, only a shifting mask of my ancestors' features, flickering one into the next. "You called me," it said, though the voice came from everywhere, a composite of every person I'd ever loved or lost. "No," I answered. "The box did." The figure smiled, or perhaps the light bent. "The box only answers those who already know its shape." As it spoke, the gears above began to slow, grinding under our own age. "What are you?" I asked. "Not a god," it said. "Not a curse. I am continuity. I am what your kind feared more than death, remembering everything." I felt the words press against my chest, heavy as gravity. Around us, the water rippled with scenes I didn't want to see, wars, celebrations, quiet moments where every bearer of the box chose silence over truth. "Why me?" I whispered. "Because you opened it," the voice replied gently. "Because you doubted." The figure reached out. Its hand made of light threaded with shadow and touched my forehead. Instantly, the world cracked. Images cascading like shards. My father weeping over the same sea, my daughter's small hands closing a lid, and behind them all, a vast library of unending shelves filled not with books, but with human hearts, each one still beating. "Every memory we lose finds its way here," the voice said. "Every denial builds another box." I felt my body dissolving, not in pain, but in understanding. "If I join you," I asked, "does it end?" The smile flickered again. "Never ends, William. It continues until someone decides to forget." And just as I began to fall into the water, I heard my wife's voice, distant but real, shouting my name, dragging me back toward the fragile weight of the waking world. When I woke, the room was still dark, yet the darkness felt thinner, stretched across the walls like something recently disturbed. My body ached with the weight of dreams, a soreness that came not from sleep but from remembering too much. The clock on the nightstand ticked normally, but each sound arrived a fraction late, as if time itself were catching up. My wife slept beside me, her breathing steady, fragile, human, proof that at least one rhythm remained untouched. I lay there for a long while, afraid to move, afraid the world might notice I was awake. The dream clung to me, not as images, but as a residue of awareness, a hum beneath thought. When I finally stood, my reflection in the mirror hesitated before following. Its eyes looked older, more certain, like someone who had seen the machinery behind the day. Downstairs, the house greeted me with quiet perfection. The scent of coffee my wife had prepared the night before, the faint blue glow of the television on standby. Nothing was wrong, but everything was aware. Even the dust motes in the morning light seemed arranged with intention. I tried to write in my journal, but every word I put down dissolved into smaller words, rearranging into phrases I didn't mean: continuity, lineage, vessel. I tore the page out, crumpled it, and heard it whisper as it folded. Outside, the world carried on, neighbors leaving for work, cars passing. But I could no longer shake the feeling that everything around me was rehearsed, repeating itself, waiting for me to forget what I had seen. The box still sat on my desk upstairs, unopened since the night before, yet I felt its pulse through the floorboards like a distant heartbeat. I told myself I wouldn't touch it again. I told myself it was over. But the truth is, ever since that dream, the silence in our house has not been silence at all. It listens, and somewhere beneath the steady rhythm of my wife's footsteps and the hum of ordinary life, I can still hear the faint mechanical click of unseen gears, waiting for me to remember the rest. It started with small coincidences, the kind you notice only when you're already watching. At the cafe near my office, the barista handed me my drink before I ordered, smiling politely as she said, "The usual, Mr. Graves," though I had never told her my name. I laughed it off, but when I checked the receipt, the printed name matched my father's handwriting. At work, my assistant began humming a melody I recognized from the dream, the slow, mechanical rhythm of turning gears, and when I asked where she'd learned it, she frowned, unable to recall. Even my daughter's phone calls began to feel rehearsed, her pauses landing in the same places as my wife's, as though they were reading from the same unseen script. I told myself it was exhaustion, that I was projecting patterns where none existed, but every day brought another fracture in the ordinary. Strangers held my gaze for a moment too long, eyes flickering with brief familiarity before they looked away. Once, in an elevator, a man beside me whispered without turning his head, "You opened it, didn't you?" His tone was casual, almost kind, but when the doors opened he walked out without another glance, leaving me with the faint scent of cedar and iron. At night the hum of the box had quieted, but the silence that replaced it was worse, expectant, patient, like something listening through the walls. My wife didn't speak of it anymore, but I could tell she felt it too. She moved more softly, choosing her words carefully, as if language itself had grown brittle. The news on television began repeating certain stories verbatim across channels, different anchors, same words, same smiles, a subtle synchronization creeping into everything. The world wasn't ending, but it was remembering piece by piece, and I was no longer sure where my memory stopped and theirs began. Some mornings I caught myself rehearsing sentences I hadn't said yet, answers to questions no one had asked. The rhythm was spreading, disguised as routine, hiding in plain sight inside the machinery of daily life. And I couldn't decide what frightened me more, that I had started it, or that it had simply been waiting for someone to notice. He waited until midnight, when Jessica's breathing softened beside him, before he slipped out of bed and walked barefoot through the hall. The air felt thicker near the living room, as if the night itself resisted his movement. The box sat where he had left it, inert, harmless in the glow of a single lamp. He told himself it was just an object, just cardboard and tape, and that whatever it represented, his guilt, his daughter's rage, the unspoken rot between them, could be ended with a simple act of destruction. He opened the sliding door to the backyard and stepped into the chill, holding the box at arm's length. The grass, damp with dew, clung to his feet like cold fingers. He set the box down on the patio bricks, struck a match, and watched the flame tremble in the wind. For a moment he hesitated, not out of fear of what was inside, but out of the irrational thought that it might feel pain. He forced himself to drop the match. The fire caught quickly, paper edges curling into black, smoke rising like a ghost exhaling through its final confession. But then, beneath the crackling, he heard it again. A sound too soft to be real, too deliberate to be imagination. A faint hissing, then a thud, as if something shifted inside. The flames flickered, dimmed, and died, leaving the box untouched, unburned, pristine as when it arrived. He staggered back, heart hammering, the spent match still burning his fingers. No smell of smoke, no ashes, no sign of heat. only the whisper of wind through the hedges and the quiet pulse of his own disbelief. When he picked up the box again, the cardboard was cold, damp with dew, yet perfectly intact. He whispered to no one, "You're not real." But even as he said it, he knew the lie. He wasn't fighting the object anymore. He was fighting the part of himself that had started to believe it was alive. Morning came like a lie. The sun spilled across the curtains, golden and indifferent, erasing every trace of the night except the one inside him. William sat at the kitchen table, staring at his trembling hands, trying to remember what he had done, what had actually happened. Had he really carried the box outside? Had there been fire, or was that just another imagined attempt to purge something that couldn't burn? Jessica moved about the kitchen in quiet motions, but her face seemed wrong, out of focus, as though painted from memory instead of flesh. When she asked, "Did you sleep?" her voice didn't sound like her own, and he wondered if she'd even spoken at all. He looked toward the living room. The box was gone. In its place, the coffee table reflected the morning light. Empty. Innocent. Relief and terror arrived together, each indistinguishable from the other. Maybe he had destroyed it. Maybe it had never existed. But then his gaze caught on something small and unremarkable at first. The shipping label, flattened, half buried beneath the rug. His own name, his own handwriting in the from field. He blinked hard, once, twice. The letters remained. He didn't remember writing them, but something inside him, the cold, whispering thing that had grown louder with every unanswered question, told him he had. Images began bleeding together. His daughter's face at 12, her laughter at 16, her anger at 34, the tremor in her voice when she'd said, "You'll regret this." He heard the echo now as if she stood behind him, whispering through the years. The kitchen clock ticked louder, each sound a heartbeat in reverse. He felt as though time itself had folded, looping the same argument, the same pain, the same desperate love until he couldn't tell if he was a father mourning his daughter or a ghost replaying his own guilt. The line between memory and punishment blurred until all that was left was the question no one could answer. Had he received the box, or had he sent it to himself long before? On the day he chose pride over forgiveness. He went to church that afternoon for the first time in years, not out of faith, but out of a hollow instinct that something sacred might still exist to hold him together. The pews were half empty, the air thick with the scent of wood polish and old hymnals. The priest's voice rose and fell in gentle waves, but William couldn't follow the sermon. The words blurred into one long whisper about mercy and inheritance and forgiveness. The last word struck him hardest, not as comfort but as accusation. Forgiveness. He'd built his whole life on discipline, on earning, on control. Mercy had always seemed like a currency he couldn't afford. Now it haunted him like unpaid debt. He closed his eyes, hands clasped, but when he tried to pray, nothing came. No words, no faith, only the shape of his daughter's face carved behind his eyelids. He remembered teaching her how to ride a bike, her small hands gripping the handlebars, her voice laughing in the wind. He remembered her graduation, her first heartbreak, her wedding. Then the arguments, the begging, the money, the shame, every memory folded into the next, like pages in a book he'd written and never read. He realized then that he had been measuring love the same way he'd measured success, by control, by order, by keeping score. The box, the fire, the fear, it wasn't punishment, it was recognition. He had raised his daughter to believe that value meant possession, that security meant having, not being. And now she had only mirrored the lesson back to him in its most cruel, desperate form. His throat tightened, the edges of confession pressing against his teeth, but he couldn't bring himself to speak it aloud. The priest walked by, offering a kind smile, but William didn't see him. He only saw the faint reflection of his own hands in the polished wood of the pew, aged, trembling, and empty. When the service ended, he stayed seated long after the others had left, until the light through the stained glass turned from gold to red to gray. Only then did he whisper to no one and to everyone, "If forgiveness is real, let it find me before she does." When William returned home, the house felt wrong in the quiet way guilt rearranges familiar walls. Jessica was sitting at the kitchen table, hands folded neatly on a napkin, eyes fixed on nothing. The late light slanted through the blinds, striping her face in gold and shadow. He knew immediately that she had been waiting, not just for him, but for something to end. "You went to church," she said without looking up. It wasn't a question. "I thought maybe I could find a way to understand," he murmured, taking the chair across from her. "Understand what?" Her voice was steady but hollow. "That your daughter sent you something to be afraid of? Or that maybe she didn't?" The words landed like cold rain. He frowned, confused, but before he could speak, she reached into the drawer beside her and placed something on the table between them. The shipping label, the same one he'd found under the rug. "I saw you staring at it this morning," she said. "You didn't ask me why I didn't tell you sooner." He stared at the label, the faint indentation of his own handwriting mocking him. "Because I didn't want to believe it," he whispered. Jessica leaned forward, eyes sharp now, cutting through his denial. "William, you ordered that box." He froze. The room tilted slightly, the sound of the refrigerator humming suddenly deafening. "What are you talking about?" "I found the receipt in your study 2 weeks ago. You used her name, but the billing was ours. You sent that box to yourself." He wanted to argue, to call it a mistake, an old transaction, anything but the truth she was naming, but her expression left no room for comfort. "I thought maybe you were trying to make a point," she said softly. "A lesson for her. You've done things like that before. Small tests, little manipulations to prove you were right. But when the police came, I realized you'd started believing your own punishment." He pushed the chair back, breath catching, the walls closing in. "No, Jessica, I didn't." "Then where's the receipt now?" she asked quietly. He had no answer, only the echo of his own handwriting and the terrible certainty that she wasn't lying. Somewhere between anger and guilt, between control and fear, he had written his own name as both sender and recipient, and in that moment he understood the box wasn't from Samantha, it was from the man he had become. That night William sat alone in his study, the lamp casting a weak circle of light across the desk. Outside, the world had gone still. No passing cars, no wind, only the faint creak of the house settling around him like an old confession. He opened the bottom drawer and found what he already knew would be there, the printed receipt, folded once, deliberate, dated 6 days before the box arrived. The ink had begun to fade, but his signature remained crisp at the bottom, a line of finality he couldn't deny. He sank back into the chair and let the silence widen. Memory began to move then, not as a rush but as a slow, cold tide. He saw the night again, the argument with Jessica, his anger at the phone call from Samantha, her refusal to take his advice, his words cutting through the static of the line like glass. "You'll understand when it's too late," he'd said. Afterward, he'd poured himself a drink, then another, scrolling through her old photos, each one a record of distance growing wider. Somewhere between guilt and grief, an idea had taken shape, something about teaching her a lesson, forcing her to face what she'd done to him, what she'd taken. He remembered typing the order, the dull logic of it, a symbolic gesture, a message wrapped as metaphor. He hadn't realized how literal it had become. He'd used her name because it made the pain smaller, easier to bear. Sending something to himself had felt like a way to transfer the weight, to make her absence tangible. But when the box arrived, the lesson had turned inward. The moment he'd seen his own handwriting, he'd rewritten the story in his mind, made her the sender, made himself the victim. It was easier that way. Easier than facing the truth that the cruelty had always come from within. The receipt trembled in his hand, and for the first time in years his anger dissolved without direction. There was only a deep, aching clarity, the kind that left no room for redemption or denial. He set the paper down carefully, as though it were something fragile, and whispered to the empty room, "I didn't want to hurt her. I just didn't want to be forgotten." The silence that followed felt like understanding, or maybe just the absence of it. William stayed in the study long after the receipt stopped trembling in his hands. The paper now felt lighter, emptied of accusation, as if its weight had been transferred back to him where it belonged. Through the window, the faint outline of dawn began to stretch along the horizon, a gray ribbon pulling the night apart. Jessica slept down the hall, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to know, that the mystery was never hers to solve. He could go to her, tell her everything, let the confession collapse between them like a bridge finally burned. But some truths, he realized, were not meant to be shared. They were meant to be carried. The kind of burden that didn't ask for forgiveness, only acknowledgement. He reached for a small tin box in the drawer, the one that had once held Samantha's childhood keepsakes, tiny shells, a silver bracelet, a folded paper crane, and placed the receipt inside. Then, without ceremony, he locked it and tucked it back into the drawer. It wasn't absolution, but it was order, and order was the only peace he understood. He stood there for a while, feeling the weight of the years press against him, the quiet hum of the world resuming beyond his window. For the first time in days, the air didn't feel haunted. The box was gone, the receipt hidden, the narrative restored to silence. He knew it wouldn't last. Truth never stayed buried forever. But for now, he let the stillness settle over him like a fragile mercy. In that small, unspoken act of containment, he finally accepted that redemption might never arrive. But the choice to stop running from himself was its own kind of grace. The years moved quietly after that. Seasons changed with a gentler rhythm, and William learned to measure his days not by what was lost, but by what remained. The house aged with him, paint softening, floors sighing, the garden returning each spring with a kind of stubborn forgiveness. He and Jessica spoke less of the past, their silences no longer barbed but companionable, as if they had both agreed that, remembering too deeply, might undo the fragile peace they'd built. Sometimes, in the early mornings, he would walk to the porch with a cup of coffee and watch the world wake. The sky would blush pink above the trees, and the birds would begin their measured chatter, oblivious to human regret. He never opened the study drawer again, though he dusted around it carefully as if tending a grave. The tin box remained sealed, its contents undisturbed, a quiet pact between him and the life he had tried to understand. On the day of his 67th birthday, Samantha called for the first time in years. Their conversation was brief, careful, like two people handling glass. But when she laughed, softly, uncertainly, he felt something inside him unclench. After they hung up, he sat by the window for a long time, sunlight slipping across the floor, and realized that forgiveness, if it ever came, had not arrived as a thunderclap or a sermon. It had come as a silence he could finally live with. He took a slow breath, the kind that reached all the way down, and let it out with a small, unguarded smile. The house was quiet, the air warm, and for the first time in a very long while, William did not feel watched by his past. He simply was, and that was enough. In the end, it wasn't the box that haunted William. It was the silence that followed, the spaces between guilt and grace, between what was done and what was meant. Sometimes, punishment doesn't arrive as thunder or fire. Sometimes it comes as understanding, quiet, patient, and irreversible. He learned too late that love without humility turns into control, and control, once broken, becomes grief. But even grief can soften if given time. Years later, when the phone rang and his daughter's voice filled the air again, he realized that forgiveness had never been hers to give. It was his to allow. We carry our regrets like unopened boxes, afraid of what waits inside. But only when we face them do we learn the truth. The weight was never in the gift, but in the giver.